What happens when a retired soldier, evicted just days before Christmas, quietly accepts his fate, only to find that his small-town mayor has a life-changing secret? Will the kindness of strangers and the spirit of the season bring the redemption he never expected? Stay tuned and discover how one man's quiet dignity inspires an entire community to act. The ticking of a clock filled the small apartment, the only sound breaking the stillness. James Carter sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by the echoes of a life well lived, but now overshadowed by hardship. A tattered photo album lay open in front of him, its pages filled with faded memories from his years of military service. There he was in his younger days, standing tall in his dress uniform, the pride of his family. The pages next to it sat a pile of unopened bills, their ominous presence a constant reminder of his current reality. James was a man of quiet dignity. Even now, with his savings dwindled and his medical expenses mounting, he carried himself with the discipline that 25 years in the Army had instilled in him. He wasn't one to complain or ask for help. His life had always been about serving others, first as a soldier, then as a mentor to younger veterans trying to adjust to civilian life. Now, at 62, with no family left and only his pension to get by, the challenges seemed insurmountable. The sound of the doorbell jolted him from his thoughts. Slowly he rose and made his way to the door, his steps deliberate, his back still straight despite the wear and tear of years. Standing outside was his landlord, Mr. Higgins, holding an envelope in one hand and wearing the smug expression James had come to expect. "Afternoon, Sergeant," Higgins said, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I hate to do this to you, but business is business. You're 3 months behind on rent. This is your final notice." James said nothing. He took the envelope and gave a short nod, his expression calm but tired. Higgins lingered for a moment, clearly expecting some kind of argument or plea for more time, but James simply closed the door. Back at the kitchen table, he opened the notice. The deadline was clear. 1 week. He stared at it for a moment, then carefully folded it and placed it alongside the bills. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve did not falter. If there was one thing James Carter knew how to do, it was to face adversity head-on. Quietly, he began packing. James's hands moved methodically, folding each piece of clothing with the precision of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of efficiency. He packed his few belongings into a worn military duffel bag that had accompanied him through countless deployments. The edges of the canvas were frayed, the green fabric faded from years of use, but it remained sturdy, just like James himself. The apartment around him felt eerily quiet. It was a modest space, sparsely furnished with a second-hand couch, a wooden coffee table, and a small television set. On the walls hung a few framed certificates of commendation from his time in the Army, alongside a shadow box displaying his medals. These were the few things he allowed himself to keep as reminders of his service. Everything else was practical, functional, a reflection of the man himself. As he packed, a soft knock sounded on the door. James hesitated for a moment before setting the duffel down and crossing the room. When he opened the door, he found his neighbor, Mrs. Gardner, standing there with a casserole dish in her hands. "Thought you might like something warm for dinner," she said with a kind but hesitant smile. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, and her hands fidgeted nervously as she held the dish out to him. James gave a small nod of gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Gardner. You didn't have to do this." She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting toward the eviction notice still taped to the door frame. I heard about what happened. It's not right, James. Not after everything you've done for this country." James smiled faintly, a gesture meant to reassure her more than himself. "Life's not always fair, Mom, but we get through it." Mrs. Gardner lingered, clearly wanting to say more, but eventually nodded and left him with the dish. As James closed the door and set it on the counter, he couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude. Even in the darkest times, there were small acts of kindness that reminded him of the good in people. He returned to his packing, placing the shadow box into the duffel with care. It was heavy, a physical manifestation of the weight he carried every day. As he zipped the bag shut, he glanced out the window. The world outside seemed unchanged. people bustling about, preparing for the holiday season. But for James, the days ahead felt like stepping into an uncertain future. The weight of the duffel bag hung heavy on James Carter's shoulder as he stepped outside into the crisp December air. He locked the door to his apartment one final time and slid the key under the mat, a gesture of silent finality. Despite the bitterness of the situation, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had seen him through countless hardships. This was not the life he envisioned after his service, but it was the one he had, and James wasn't one to wallow in self-pity. As he made his way down the icy sidewalk, a small group of children ran past, their laughter cutting through the otherwise somber moment. They were pulling a sled piled high with wrapped presents, their cheeks rosy from the cold. James paused to watch them disappear down the street, their joy briefly lighting a small flicker of warmth in his chest. It reminded him of the Christmases he had spent overseas, when his platoon had done their best to recreate the holiday spirit with care packages from home in a tinsel-decorated mess hall. Those memories were bittersweet now. "James!" a familiar voice called out, breaking his reverie. He turned to see Mr. Collins, the elderly shopkeeper who ran the corner convenience store, shuffling toward him with a bag in hand. Collins, hunched and slightly out of breath, held out the bag with a determined expression. "I heard what happened," Collins said, his voice gruff but tinged with sympathy. "Figured you might need these." James peered into the bag and found it filled with essentials, canned goods, a loaf of bread, a thermos, and even a pair of wool gloves. It was a simple gesture, but James felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, Mr. Collins," he said quietly. "You didn't have to do this." "Yeah, well," Collins muttered, looking down at his shoes. "You've done plenty for this country. Least someone can do is make sure you don't go hungry." James nodded, his gratitude unspoken but palpable. As he adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, he noticed the faint flicker of lights in the distance. The town square's Christmas decorations had just been turned on, their warm glow casting a cheerful contrast against the starkness of his situation. He adjusted his cap and continued walking, his destination unclear. For now he just needed to keep moving. Somewhere deep inside, he hoped that the same town he had served in silence might have something left to offer him in return. James walked through the dimly lit streets, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. The sounds of holiday cheer echoed faintly in the distance. Carolers singing on a corner, laughter spilling out of a local diner, the jingle of a Salvation Army bell outside a grocery store. These small signs of the season, meant to evoke warmth and togetherness, only made James feel more isolated. He had always found solace in simplicity, but this year, the weight of his struggles felt heavier than ever. He stopped in front of a small diner he frequented, its neon open sign flickering faintly in the window. The warm glow of the interior looked inviting, and he debated going inside for a coffee. A quick glance at his wallet, however, made him hesitate. Funds were tight, and every penny counted. He was about to keep walking when the door opened and a young waitress named Claire poked her head out. No matter how many times Claire poked her head out to see her new patron, his former diners had begun to seem forgotten. "Hey, Mr. Carter," she called with a cheerful smile. "Haven't seen you in a bit. Why don't you come in and warm up?" James hesitated. Claire was a kind soul, always making small talk and slipping him extra coffee refills when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't want to take advantage of her generosity. Still, the thought of a warm cup of coffee and a moment's reprieve from the cold was too tempting to pass up. Inside, the diner was buzzing with activity. Families shared meals, friends exchanged gifts, and the air smelled of fresh-baked pies and frying bacon. James settled into his usual corner booth, and Claire brought over a steaming cup of coffee before he even had to ask. "On the house," she said with a wink, placing a plate of cookies beside it. "It's Christmas, after all." James chuckled softly. "You're too kind, Claire, thank you." As he sipped his coffee, a group of teenagers in a nearby booth caught his attention. They were noisily exchanging stories and joking around, but when James noticed one of them glance over at him, the boy quickly hushed his friends. For a moment, James felt self-conscious, worried they were judging him. Then he realized it wasn't pity or disdain in their expressions. It was respect. One of the boys even gave him a small nod, as though acknowledging something unspoken. James left a modest tip on the table, despite Claire's protests, and made his way back out into the cold night. As he walked, he thought about the quiet kindness he had just experienced. Though his situation hadn't changed, the humanity of strangers offered him a glimmer of hope that perhaps he wasn't as alone as he felt. The night had grown colder by the time James reached the edge of the town square. A towering Christmas tree stood in the center, its lights twinkling like stars against the dark sky. Around it, families strolled hand in hand, children played tag, and vendors sold hot cocoa and roasted chestnuts. The festive energy was almost overwhelming, a sharp contrast to the somber weight James carried on his shoulders. Olivia. He found a bench at the edge of the square and set his duffel bag down at his feet. His gaze lingered on the tree, memories of past Christmases drifting into his mind, holidays spent overseas with his platoon, singing carols off-key and sharing rations that someone had tried to pass off as a turkey dinner. Despite the hardships, those moments had been filled with camaraderie and a sense of purpose. Now the emptiness gnawed at him, more potent than the chill in the air. As he sat in silence, he noticed the mayor across the square greeting townspeople with his usual warm demeanor. Mayor Thomas Green was a respected figure in the community, known not just for his leadership but also for his service as a veteran. James had met him a few times at local events for former servicemen, and though their interactions were brief, James had always respected the man. The mayor's eyes scanned the crowd, and for a moment they landed on James. A flicker of recognition passed across his face. He excused himself from the group he was speaking with and began making his way across the square, his cane tapping rhythmically against the cobblestones. James straightened up instinctively, his military training kicking in despite the casual setting. "James Carter," the mayor said warmly as he approached. "It's good to see you. How are you holding up?" James hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I'm managing, sir. Just taking it one day at a time." The mayor's expression shifted, a mix of understanding and concern. He glanced at the duffel bag at James's feet, then back at the man himself. "It's not right what's happened to you," he said quietly. "You've given so much to this country, and you deserve better." James shook his head. "Life's tough, but I'll figure it out. Always have." Mayor Green smiled faintly, his eyes betraying a deeper plan forming in his mind. "You know, James," he said, his tone shifting slightly, "sometimes we don't realize how much people around us care until we let them in." Before James could respond, the mayor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stay strong, Sergeant," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "And don't lose hope. Good things have a way of finding those who deserve them." As the mayor walked away, James sat back, his thoughts swirling. For the first time in a long while, he felt a strange mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. The world hadn't been kind to him lately, but something about the mayor's words lingered, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The hum of a phone call filled the quiet office of Mayor Thomas Green as he sat behind his cluttered desk, tapping his pen thoughtfully against a yellow legal pad. His conversation with James the previous evening had been weighing on him, and as the sun rose, so did his determination to do something about it. Across the desk sat his assistant, Maria, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern, as the mayor finished dialing yet another number. "Listen," the mayor said firmly into the phone. "I don't care how tight the deadline is. This isn't just another project. This is for someone who has served this country with more dedication than most people can imagine. Let me know what we can do by the end of the day." He hung up and leaned back, pinching the bridge of his nose. Maria handed him a cup of coffee without a word, knowing better than to interrupt his train of thought. After a moment, the mayor broke the silence. "We're not just going to sit by and let this happen, Maria, not on my watch." Maria nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "What's the plan?" Mayor Green gestured to a file on his desk, a dossier he had put together about James Carter. "This man's story deserves more than just pity. He needs action. I've already reached out to a few donors and local businesses. The idea is to fund a permanent solution, not just a temporary fix. If we pull this off, it'll be something he never sees coming." Maria leaned forward, intrigued. You mean, like a new home? Exactly, the mayor replied, his tone brightening with the possibility. And not just any home, something that shows him how much this community values him. He's a part of us, whether he realizes it or not. Maria began jotting down notes, her own excitement growing. Who do we need to involve? Everyone, the mayor said with a grin. This town owes him, from construction crews to local volunteers. We're going to make this happen, and we're doing it before Christmas. As the day unfolded, phone calls were made, meetings were held, and plans began to solidify. The mayor's energy was infectious, and soon the entire town hall was buzzing with excitement over the project. Word spread quickly, and by the afternoon, business owners, carpenters, and even high school students were volunteering to pitch in. For Mayor Green, this wasn't just about building a house. It was about restoring dignity to a man who had sacrificed so much. With every call he made and every resource he secured, he imagined James's reaction, the look of surprise and disbelief when he realized just how much he mattered. The mayor paused for a moment, staring out the window at the bustling town square below. This is what Christmas should be about, he murmured to himself. Not just lights and decorations, but real compassion. The following morning, James woke up to the sharp chill of winter air creeping through the small cracks of his apartment's aging windows. The duffel bag he'd packed the night before sat at the foot of his bed, like a reminder of the inevitable. He dressed slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he were preparing for a mission he didn't want to undertake. By midday, he would have to leave the only semblance of a home he had left. Down the hall, his landlord, Mr. Higgins, was already pacing the corridor with a clipboard in hand. He knocked on James's door sharply, and didn't wait long before calling out, "Carter, you ready to be out by noon?" James opened the door, his face calm but weary. "I'll be out," he replied simply, keeping his tone neutral. "Good," Higgins said with a smug grin. "New tenants are eager to move in. Don't want them seeing a mess." James ignored the jab and closed the door without another word. His focus was on the task ahead. He gathered his few belongings and slung the duffel over his shoulder, the familiar weight a small comfort in an otherwise uncertain moment. As he stepped outside, the crisp air greeted him like an old adversary. He paused to glance around the neighborhood he'd called home for years, unsure when or if he'd return. The town seemed unchanged, its streets bustling with holiday shoppers and families preparing for Christmas. The stark contrast between their joy and his solitude was not lost on him. Across town, however, a very different scene was unfolding. The mayor stood in the center of a half-acre plot of land, surrounded by volunteers and equipment. Builders measured lumber, electricians unpacked tools, and local teenagers carried supplies with eager enthusiasm. The entire community seemed to have rallied behind the mayor's call to action. "Let's keep it moving, folks," the mayor called out, his voice booming with energy. "We've got a tight deadline, and James deserves nothing but the best." One of the volunteers, a local carpenter named Rick, approached the mayor. "We'll have the frame up by tonight," he said confidently. "Weather permitting, we can finish the roof by the end of tomorrow." The mayor clapped Rick on the back. "That's what I like to hear. The sooner this comes together, the sooner James gets the surprise of a lifetime." As the workers continued their efforts, a group of children decorated the edges of the property with garlands and small ornaments, turning the construction site into a holiday wonderland. Every person, young and old, seemed determined to play their part in the ambitious project. Meanwhile, James wandered aimlessly through the town square, unaware of the flurry of activity happening just a few streets away. He stopped in front of a holiday window display at the hardware store, his reflection staring back at him amidst scenes of cheerful families and glowing lights. For James, it felt like another Christmas spent on the outside looking in. Little did he know, the town he had served in silence was about to bring him back into the fold in a way he could never have imagined. The day wore on, and James found himself seated on a bench at the edge of the town square, the cold metal biting through his coat. He watched as families hurried past, their arms filled with shopping bags and children skipping along excitedly. Every smile, every laugh seemed like a world away from his own reality. The duffel bag at his feet held all that remained of his life, yet no one gave him a second glance. And the way the women laughed and talked. Suddenly, the familiar sound of a cane tapping against the cobblestones caught his attention. He looked up to see Mayor Green approaching with his usual steady stride. The mayor's face was lit with a warmth that felt out of place against the frosty day. "James," the mayor greeted, his voice cutting through the hum of the bustling square. "Do you have a moment?" James nodded, adjusting his posture out of habit. "For you, sir?" "Always." The mayor gestured for James to follow him, leading the way through the square and down a quieter street. "I know you've been going through a rough patch," he began, his tone serious but kind. "I've been thinking about what we can do to make things right." James raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing the mayor to continue. They turned a corner, and James noticed that the usually quiet street seemed unusually active. Trucks and vans were parked along the curb, and groups of people were gathered in small clusters, their voices buzzing with excitement. "What's going on here?" James asked, a hint of suspicion creeping into his voice. The mayor smiled enigmatically. "You'll see." As they approached the source of the commotion, James's breath caught. In front of him stood a house. A brand-new structure that hadn't been there just days before. The frame was solid, the walls painted a warm shade of cream, and the front porch was adorned with festive garlands and twinkling lights. It was a home that seemed to radiate warmth and welcome. Workers bustled around, hammering nails and carrying supplies, while others hung decorations with care. A small group of children were busy placing a handmade welcome home sign in the front yard. James stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting between the house and the mayor. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The mayor placed a hand on James's shoulder. "This, Sergeant Carter, is a small token of gratitude from a community that owes you more than you'll ever know." James's throat tightened, and he struggled to find the words. For a moment, all he could do was stand there, overwhelmed by the scene unfolding before him. The people who had once seemed indifferent were now rallying together in an effort to honor him in a way he never expected. As the mayor walked him closer to the house, James noticed familiar faces among the crowd. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and even a few veterans he had mentored over the years. Each of them smiled or waved, their gestures speaking volumes about their respect and admiration. For the first time in a long while, James felt the icy grip of isolation begin to thaw. He wasn't just an invisible figure in the background anymore. He was part of something bigger, a community that cared deeply, even when he thought they hadn't noticed. James stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the house before him. The warm, cream-colored walls and the garlands wrapped around the porch railing felt like something out of a dream. A lump formed in his throat as he watched the activity buzzing around the property, the hammers striking nails, the cheerful chatter of volunteers, and the twinkling lights framing the scene like a holiday card. It was almost too much to process. "Mayor Green," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "is this for me?" The mayor nodded, his smile broad but humble. "It is, James. This is for you. And before you say anything, let me stop you right there. You deserve this, more than you know." James shook his head in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would anyone do this?" Before the mayor could respond, a voice called out from the crowd, "Because you've done more for us than we could ever repay." James turned to see Mr. Collins, the shopkeeper who had handed him the bag of essentials the day before, stepping forward. "You've been there for this town, James," Collins continued, "mentoring the younger veterans, helping people when they needed it, even when you had little to give yourself. It's about time someone gave something back to you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and more faces came into view. Claire, the waitress from the diner, waved from the porch where she was stringing lights. Rick, the carpenter, was busy nailing a beam in place, but paused long enough to give James a thumbs up. Even the group of teenagers from the diner had joined in, now hanging ornaments on a small tree near the driveway. "Everyone chipped in," Mayor Green said, gesturing to the gathered crowd. "From the construction materials to the decorations. This was a community effort." We wanted to show you how much you mean to us, even if we don't always say it." James felt his knees go weak, and he steadied himself against the mayor's arm. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the mayor replied gently. "Just know that you're not alone, James. Not anymore." As James took a tentative step closer to the house, a group of children ran up to him, each holding small, wrapped gifts. "These are for you, Mr. Carter," one of them exclaimed, beaming up at him. James knelt down, his eyes brimming with tears as he accepted the gifts. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you. All of you." The moment was interrupted by a loud cheer as the workers placed the final beam on the roof, signaling that the structure was almost complete. Someone started singing a Christmas carol, and soon the entire crowd joined in, their voices filling the air with warmth and joy. James stood among them, no longer an outsider but a part of something greater, a community that had rallied to show their gratitude. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging that went beyond words. This wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of hope, love, and the strength of people coming together. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the nearly completed house, James stood on the porch, still grappling with the enormity of what was happening. Volunteers bustled around, some adding finishing touches to the interior, while others strung up more lights to give the home an extra sparkle. The community's energy was infectious, but James felt a quiet moment of reflection settling over him. Mayor Green reappeared, carrying a large wooden box tied with a red ribbon. "James," he said, placing the box on the porch railing, "this is from all of us. Open it." James hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he untied the ribbon and opened the lid. Inside was a beautifully engraved plaque that read, "In gratitude for your service and sacrifice, this home is a gift from your community, with love and respect." Alongside the plaque were keys to the house, resting on a bed of soft velvet. For a moment James was overwhelmed with emotion, unable to speak. He traced the lettering on the plaque with his fingers, his mind racing through memories of hardship, sacrifice, and resilience. Finally, he looked up at the mayor and the crowd gathered around the house. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You've all done so much more than I could have ever imagined. I've spent so long thinking I was alone, but you've shown me that I'm not." The crowd erupted into applause, and Claire, the waitress, stepped forward with a tray holding 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. "Here," she said with a bright smile, handing one to James. "This is your home now. Time to start enjoying it." James chuckled softly, taking a sip and letting the warmth spread through him. "Thank you, Claire. And thank all of you, truly." The mayor raised his hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. "Before we call it a night," he said, "there's one more thing we need to do." The crowd parted to reveal a choir of children holding candles, their soft glow illuminating the twilight. They began to sing Silent Night, their voices filling the air with a sense of peace and unity. As the song reached its final verse, snow began to fall lightly, dusting the newly built home and the people surrounding it. James looked around at the faces of his neighbors, each of them smiling warmly. For the first time in years, he felt the true spirit of Christmas, a feeling of belonging, love, and hope. He didn't just have a roof over his head. He had a community that cared, and that was the greatest gift of all. The landlord, Higgins, stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold. His smug confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by a visible discomfort. The generosity and unity of the community had left him visibly shaken, his greed exposed against the backdrop of kindness. Higgins turned and walked away, his head hanging low. As the evening came to a close, James stood on the porch of his new home, the keys to his future clutched tightly in his hand. The people around him began to disperse, offering hugs and well wishes as they departed. Mayor Green lingered for a moment longer, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Merry Christmas, Sergeant," the mayor said. "This town is better because of you." James smiled, a genuine smile that hadn't graced his face in years. "Merry Christmas," he replied, his his voice filled with gratitude. As the snow continued to fall, James stepped inside his new home, feeling at last that he truly belonged.